What do this kitten and this bacteria cell have in common? The answer? They both became living organisms through reproduction, which is the process of making offspring. It doesn't matter if you have one cell or trillions of cells. Being able to reproduce is a defining characteristic of being alive. Of course, there are some striking differences in the way organisms make offspring. There's sexual reproduction, which is a type of reproduction that requires two parents. In other words, it takes a mommy cat and a daddy cat to make a kitten. In sexual reproduction, genes are combined from both parents, so offspring are genetically unique. There's also asexual reproduction, which is a type of reproduction in which only one parent is involved. This is how the bacteria cell reproduces. With asexual reproduction, all of the genes come from a single parent, so the offspring are genetically identical to the parent. There are different ways organisms reproduce asexually. Let's take a look at some of the most common types. For many one-celled organisms, like bacteria, binary fission is the way to go. This is a type of asexual reproduction in which a cell divides into two cells. This is a fairly easy term to remember if you recall that the prefix bi means two, like a bicycle has two wheels. The word fission means dividing, so binary fission is literally dividing in two. When a bacterium is ready to reproduce, it makes a copy of its DNA and then splits, giving the copy to a newly formed and identical bacteria cell. This can be a very quick process, allowing bacteria to multiply several times an hour if conditions are right. That means a single bacteria cell could grow into millions in less than a day. Fortunately, conditions for bacterial reproduction are rarely ideal, or our world would be overrun by bacteria. Another type of asexual reproduction is called fragmentation. With this process, we see that an organism splits into pieces, and each piece develops into a new organism. There are some creatures of the land and sea that will do this. For example, some worms have the ability to split in two and continue life as two separate worms. Likewise, you could slice a starfish into pieces and make new starfish. You can chop off a starfish's leg, and as long as it has some of the central disc attached, it will regenerate into a new offspring. Budding is another type of asexual reproduction. This happens when an organism forms a growth that develops into a new organism and then breaks off. For example, a cellular organism like a yeast cell can grow a bud filled with its own cells. That bud will stay attached until it's grown and developed. At that time, it will drop off, forming an identical offspring. We also see budding in some basic sea creatures, like some species of jellyfish. Jellyfish don't rely solely on asexual reproduction, but it is part of the process of making a new offspring. First, a fertilized egg from jellyfish parents grows into a polyp that attaches itself to a rock. The polyp then grows genetically identical buds that get released and become new jellyfish. Vegetative propagation is a way for plants to reproduce without seeds. When you think about plants growing in your garden, you probably think about planting seeds in the ground and watching the bees pollinate the plants once they grow. However, seeds and pollen are not the only way plants can reproduce. With vegetative propagation, a new plant grows from parts of the original plant. Like other forms of asexual reproduction, vegetative propagation results in genetically identical offspring. An example is taking a cutting of a plant. This is a process of taking part of one plant to grow a new plant. Certain plants, including many herbs, can develop this way by simply chopping off a part of the stem or root and placing it in the soil. Just add some water and a little bit of tender love and care, and your new cutting will develop roots and grow. Let's review. Reproduction is the process of making offspring. We learned that there are two basic ways to reproduce. Sexual reproduction is a type of reproduction that requires two parents and results in offspring that are genetically unique. Asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction in which only one parent is involved and results in offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. For this lesson, we focused on different types of asexual reproduction. We learned that some simple organisms like bacteria can reproduce through binary fission, which is a process in which a cell divides into two cells. Other organisms, like some worms and starfish, can reproduce using fragmentation. With this process, we see that an organism splits into pieces, and each piece develops into a new organism. Some organisms, like yeast cells, use budding to make their offspring. This happens when an organism forms a growth that develops into a new organism and then breaks off. We also learned that vegetative propagation is a way for plants to reproduce without seeds. With vegetative propagation, a new plant grows from parts of the original plant. One way to achieve this is by taking a cutting of a plant and placing it in the soil so it can develop roots.
We just learned about 4 types of asexual reproduction that produce genetically identical offspring. In the past, this was all called cloning. Nowadays, cloning is a type of sexual reproduction that is done in a lab, and it produces identical offspring from a multicellular organism. The multicellular organism can be a plant. Plant cloning is fairly simple. You can get a plant that you want to clone and get a few cells out of it, put it on a nutrient agar, which is basically food, and then in a suspension that will help it grow and go through mitosis really quick. Once it goes through mitosis and it becomes an embryo, you can plant that embryo, and as the plant grows, it will grow into a plant that is identical to the one that you started out with. Animal cloning is a little bit more complicated. It requires 3 parents. The first parent is the one that will provide all the genetic information. This parent will give us a cell with all the information that we want to clone. The second parent is going to provide kind of like the shell for it. So we're going to get a cell from it and remove the DNA. Then these 2 cells are going to get fused, and they will be induced again to go through mitosis so that we can get an embryo. This embryo is going to grow in the lab. Then this embryo needs a mommy. So we're going to put this embryo into a third parent that will eventually nurture and give birth to a clone from the first parent whose genetic information we took out. If you are interested in playing and learning more about cloning, I have provided a link for you. So you learn about asexual reproduction, and you also know about sexual reproduction. In our next lesson, you will learn about the advantages and disadvantages of both.